I recently saw you on the street, and for a second, my whole world stopped. My heart didn't know whether to run toward you or away from you. I recently saw you on the street, and though I smiled on the outside, inside I shattered. You looked so fine without me, and it hurt more than I expected. I recently saw you on the street, and I realized something. I still remember the way you breathe, the rhythm of your walk, the calm in your chaos. I recently saw you on the street, and all the words I rehearsed in my mind vanished. My silence screamed everything I ever wanted to tell you. I recently saw you on the street, and I swear time bent itself to let me stare just a little longer, just enough to feel that ache again. I recently saw you on the street, looking like someone who never broke, never cried, never missed me, and I envied your peace. I recently saw you on the street, and it felt like watching a ghost, familiar, distant, and painfully beautiful. I recently saw you on the street, and every step you took away from me reminded me how far we've drifted since love left. I recently saw you on the street, and the air between us felt heavier than words. You didn't have to look at me. I already knew you felt it too. I recently saw you on the street, and I pretended not to care. But my soul whispered your name for hours afterward. I recently saw you on the street, and it hit me how cruel time is. It changes everything except the way I feel about you. I recently saw you on the street, and I noticed how your smile has changed. It used to be mine. Now it belongs to someone else. I recently saw you on the street, and my heart forgot all the reasons we fell apart. It just remembered how it felt to love you. I recently saw you on the street, and for a moment I wondered if you saw me too, or if I'm the only one still haunted. I recently saw you on the street, and I almost called your name, but I stopped because ghosts shouldn't disturb the living. I recently saw you on the street, and I realized love doesn't end. It just hides in the way you still look at me. I recently saw you on the street, and it broke me that I could recognize your laugh, but not your life anymore. I recently saw you on the street, and I remembered every night I prayed to forget you. God must have laughed. I recently saw you on the street, and suddenly every wall I built to protect myself crumbled. One glance, and I was yours again. I recently saw you on the street, and I couldn't decide what hurt more, missing you or pretending I didn't. I recently saw you on the street, and the memories came back louder than ever. Love never really leaves. It just hides in plain sight. I recently saw you on the street, and your eyes said what your lips refused. You still feel it too. I recently saw you on the street, and though I've grown stronger, your presence reminded me how soft my heart still is for you. I recently saw you on the street, and every piece of me whispered, "Please look back." You didn't. I recently saw you on the street, and I realized you were never the villain. We just weren't ready for the love we had. I recently saw you on the street, and I understood. Closure isn't a conversation, it's a quiet acceptance that they've moved on. I recently saw you on the street, and my hands shook. I wasn't nervous. I was remembering what safety used to feel like. I recently saw you on the street, and for a moment, I was home again. But homes can burn, and mine already did. I recently saw you on the street, and I knew no matter how far I go, some parts of me will always wait for you. I recently saw you on the street, and I wished you'd notice the tears I didn't let fall. I recently saw you on the street, and your face looked softer, wiser, colder, like someone who's learned to live without me. I recently saw you on the street, and I wanted to hate you for being okay, but I couldn't. You looked too beautiful for hate. I recently saw you on the street, and I realized that moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to live with what still hurts. I recently saw you on the street, and for a second, I thought we could start again. Then I saw the ring on your finger. I recently saw you on the street, and you looked happy. I told myself that was enough, even if it wasn't with me. I recently saw you on the street, and I wondered if you knew how many times I've imagined that exact moment. I recently saw you on the street, and your perfume lingered like a secret I couldn't forget. I recently saw you on the street, and the way you looked past me was louder than any goodbye. I recently saw you on the street, and my heart whispered, "There's the one I lost, but never stopped loving." I recently saw you on the street, and I finally understood why storms come back. They miss the ground they once touched. I recently saw you on the street, and your eyes were calm. Mine were oceans trying to stay still. I recently saw you on the street, and it stunned me how effortlessly you walked past the place where I'm still stuck. I recently saw you on the street, and my chest ached, not from love, but from all the words I never said. I recently saw you on the street, and I wondered if you felt that electric pull, too, or if that magic died only for me. I recently saw you on the street, and the way you laughed with someone else felt like watching my favorite song being sung by another voice. I recently saw you on the street, and for a moment, It felt like the universe was giving me a cruel reminder of what peace used to look like. I recently saw you on the street, and I had to remind myself to breathe, to act normal, to not fall apart again. I recently saw you on the street, and I realized that memories don't fade. They just wait for the right face to wake them up. I recently saw you on the street, and every heartbeat felt like it was whispering your name against my will. I recently saw you on the street, and I wish the world would pause just long enough for me to say, I still care. I recently saw you on the street, and the silence between us was heavier than every conversation we ever had. I recently saw you on the street, and it broke me how you didn't even flinch. Once, my presence made your heart race. I recently saw you on the street, and I felt like I was staring at the life I could have had if I'd just loved you right. I recently saw you on the street, and it reminded me how endings don't happen once. They happen every time you see them again. I recently saw you on the street, and though we didn't speak, my heart whispered everything your ears will never hear. I recently saw you on the street, and I couldn't stop thinking about how love turns into strangers pretending not to know each other. I recently saw you on the street, and I wished I could tell you that no one has ever made me feel that alive again. I recently saw you on the street, and it took everything in me not to run to you like I used to. I recently saw you on the street, and it felt like watching a movie I'd once starred in but no longer belonged to. I recently saw you on the street, and my body remembered every place your hands once claimed as home. I recently saw you on the street, and I smiled like I was fine. But inside, it felt like a funeral for the love we buried. I recently saw you on the street, and I realized how much I've changed. I can look at you now and not fall apart completely. I recently saw you on the street, and I wished time could rewind back to when your eyes searched for me the way mine still do for you. I recently saw you on the street, and it amazed me how your existence still has the power to ruin my calm. I recently saw you on the street, and I remembered how deeply I once believed you'd never leave. I recently saw you on the street, and I finally understood that some people remain in your soul even when they vanish from your life. I recently saw you on the street, and I caught myself smiling. Maybe this is healing, loving you without breaking this time. I recently saw you on the street, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw love in your eyes again. Maybe I was wrong, maybe I wasn't. I recently saw you on the street, and you looked happier, and though it stung, I whispered to the wind, I hope you stay that way. I recently saw you on the street, and I couldn't tell if the ache in my chest was nostalgia or regret. I recently saw you on the street, and the memories we shared replayed so vividly, I forgot for a second that you're no longer mine. I recently saw you on the street, and your shadow brushed past mine. For a moment, it felt like fate still had unfinished business. I recently saw you on the street, and it reminded me that love never truly ends. It just changes its shape and tone. I recently saw you on the street, and every emotion I'd buried beneath my pride rose like fire through my veins. I recently saw you on the street, and I wanted to ask if you ever think of me, but I didn't want to know the answer. I recently saw you on the street, and it made me realize how some faces never fade, no matter how many new ones we meet. I recently saw you on the street, and I thought about how strange it is, how love can make strangers out of soulmates. I recently saw you on the street, and though I looked calm, my heart was fighting to hold back a storm. I recently saw you on the street, and it reminded me of how love can be both a memory and a wound at the same time. I recently saw you on the street, and I could feel my old self reaching for you, begging me not to walk away again. I recently saw you on the street, and the universe went silent, as if even it wanted to listen to the sound of my breaking heart. I recently saw you on the street, and I wanted to tell you I've forgiven you, but I didn't want to reopen the ache.